A man in his early 40s sits at a desk. He is not sick. His annual blood work came back clean. He exercises 3 times a week. He eats what most people would call a reasonable diet. He drinks plenty of water, or at least he thinks he does. And yet, inside his body, something is quietly going wrong. His liver is accumulating fat. The bacteria in his gums have been slipping into his bloodstream for years. A specific type of fat, the kind that wraps around his organs like insulation, is releasing inflammatory chemicals into his bloodstream every single hour of every single day. His brain, during the 6 hours he sleeps each night, is not getting enough time to clean itself. A waste product that scientists link directly to Alzheimer's disease is building up in his hippocampus. He has no idea. He feels fine. This video is not about the habits that obviously harm you. It is not about smoking a pack a day or eating fast food for every meal. It is about the things that seem neutral or even reasonable that are silently accelerating the aging of your body right now. Some of them are things almost every person reading this does every single day. The science on all of them is not disputed. It is peer-reviewed, replicated, and somehow still almost entirely absent from mainstream health conversations. There is a specific kind of headache that billions of people have come to accept as normal. It appears in the afternoon. It settles behind the eyes or at the base of the skull. You take a painkiller, it fades, and by the next day you have forgotten it happened. There is also a kind of fatigue that people have stopped noticing. It is not dramatic tiredness. It is more like a low ceiling, a constant sense of operating at 60% of your actual capacity. You wake up, and within an hour you already want to lie down again. And there is the digestive discomfort, the bloating after meals, the feeling that something is not quite right in your gut, but it never reaches the level where you would call a doctor. What all of these things share is that modern life has normalized them so thoroughly that most people have stopped considering them symptoms at all. But here is what the research actually shows. When your body runs under chronic low-grade stress, and chronic stress does not have to feel dramatic to be real, your hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, the system your body uses to manage stress hormones, stays switched on. This continuous activation prevents tissue repair. It elevates pro-inflammatory chemicals in your blood, specifically molecules called interleukin-1 beta, interleukin-6, and tumor necrosis factor alpha. These are not abstract concepts. They are measurable compounds that your immune system uses to fight infections. When they run at low levels all the time, even without an infection, they quietly damage tissues across your entire body. Persistent tension headaches are frequently a sign that your brain is not clearing its own waste efficiently enough during sleep, a process we will come back to later in detail. Recurring digestive discomfort often signals that the lining of your gut has become slightly more permeable than it should be, allowing bacterial fragments into places they should not reach. And chronic fatigue that does not improve with rest is one of the earliest detectable signs that your body's internal signaling systems are misfiring. The reason these warning signs matter is not that any one of them is individually catastrophic. It is that when ignored, they represent a slow drift away from homeostasis, the balanced state your body works hard to maintain. Small warning signs ignored become large problems that no longer respond to small solutions. The first health mistake almost everyone makes is treating their body's early distress signals as background noise. Here is something researchers call the active couch potato problem, and it describes the majority of working adults in developed countries. You exercise, maybe 30 minutes in the morning, maybe an hour at the gym, and then you sit at your desk for 8 hours. You sit in your car for 40 minutes. You sit on your sofa for 2 hours in the evening. You go to bed. It turns out that those hours of sitting are not canceled out by the exercise. They are a separate problem entirely, and the mechanism behind why is genuinely surprising. Inside your muscles, particularly the large oxidative muscle fibers in your legs and lower body, there is an enzyme called lipoprotein lipase. Its job is to pull fat from your blood and burn it as fuel. This enzyme does not function while you are sitting. Within hours of uninterrupted sitting, its activity in those muscle fibers drops by up to 90%. This means that the fat circulating in your blood is not being cleared. It stays there. Triglyceride levels rise. The production of protective high-density lipoprotein cholesterol falls. At the same time, a protein called GLUT4, which normally moves to the surface of muscle cells to absorb glucose from the blood after a meal, stops moving. Blood glucose stays elevated longer than it should. The pancreas responds by releasing more insulin. Over time, this cycle teaches your cells to become less responsive to insulin, a state called insulin resistance, which sits at the root of type 2 diabetes, fatty liver disease, and metabolic syndrome. Research published in the journal Physiological Reviews confirmed that 2 to 4 days of prolonged sitting, defined as more than 14 hours per day, produced measurable increases in postprandial triglyceride responses. meaning the fat in someone's blood after a meal was significantly higher than in people who interrupted their sitting regularly. The cardiovascular consequences accumulate separately. The World Health Organization's 2020 Physical Activity Guidelines, updated specifically to address this data, explicitly stated that adults with prolonged sitting time face increased risk of cardiovascular disease, type 2 diabetes, cancer, and all-cause mortality, independent of whether they exercise. The solution is not to stand all day either. It is to break up sitting. 2 minutes of walking every 20 minutes is enough, based on clinical research, to restore normal postprandial glucose response by approximately 38%. The interruption is what matters, not the intensity. The second health mistake is sitting for hours without movement, and assuming that your morning workout covers the rest of the day. In 2012, a team of researchers at the University of Rochester made a discovery that genuinely rewrote what neuroscience thought it knew about the brain. For over a century, it was assumed that the brain lacked a traditional waste removal system. The lymphatic system drains toxins and cellular waste from the rest of your body. But the brain, it was believed, worked differently. It turned out the brain has its own dedicated version of this system. It is called the glymphatic system, and it uses cerebrospinal fluid, the clear liquid that surrounds and cushions the brain, to flush metabolic waste out of brain tissue. The catch, which changes everything about how we should think about sleep, is this. The glymphatic system functions almost entirely during deep sleep. It is nearly inactive while you are awake. What kind of waste is it clearing? Two proteins in particular, amyloid beta and tau. Both are produced during normal brain activity. Amyloid beta accumulates steadily throughout the day as your neurons fire and communicate. In healthy brains, sleep clears it out. In Alzheimer's disease, this protein clumps into plaques that disrupt neural communication and trigger inflammation. Tau, meanwhile, normally stabilizes the internal structure of neurons. In Alzheimer's and related diseases, misfolded tau forms tangles inside neurons that ultimately kill them. The research on this is now quite clear. A study using PET imaging, a brain scanning technique that measures specific protein concentrations, showed that even a single night of sleep deprivation produced a measurable increase in amyloid beta burden in the hippocampus and thalamus of healthy young people, not in people with Alzheimer's, in healthy people. After one bad night, a randomized crossover trial published in Nature Communications in 2026, involving 39 participants, found that glymphatic clearance during normal sleep increased morning plasma levels of Alzheimer's disease biomarkers compared to sleep deprivation, meaning the waste was successfully moved out of the brain. The sleep-deprived group did not achieve that clearance. During the deepest phase of sleep, called slow wave or non-REM sleep, the space between brain cells actually expands by over 60%. This widening of the interstitial space dramatically lowers the resistance to cerebrospinal fluid flow, allowing the glymphatic system to function at peak efficiency. When you cut sleep short, you are cutting short the single most important maintenance window your brain has. Beyond the amyloid issue, sleep deprivation disrupts two hormones that regulate hunger: leptin, which signals fullness, and ghrelin, which signals hunger. Even a few nights of insufficient sleep shift this balance toward hunger and craving, particularly for calorie-dense foods. Weight gain in sleep-deprived people is partially a hormonal consequence, not simply a matter of discipline. Adults who sleep fewer than 7 hours consistently perform worse on memory and reaction tasks than those who sleep 8 hours. But here is the uncomfortable part. They consistently rate themselves as functioning normally. The loss is invisible to the person experiencing it. The third health mistake is treating sleep as optional time you can borrow from. In most cultures, the signal to stop eating is fullness. You keep going until you feel satisfied. The plate is empty. The feeling of discomfort arrives and you know you are done. The problem is biological. Fullness is not a real-time signal. By the time you feel completely full, you have typically already overeaten. Here is why. The hormones responsible for telling your brain that enough food has arrived, specifically peptide YY and glucagon-like peptide 1, released from the gut, take time to reach the hypothalamus. When food is consumed slowly, your gut releases these hormones progressively, and the satiety signal arrives while you are still eating at a reasonable pace. When food is consumed quickly, or in very large portions, these signals are still in transit when you have already cleared the plate. The result of eating until complete fullness, consistently, is a kind of chronic gastric overdistension. The stomach repeatedly stretched beyond its comfortable capacity. Over time, this suppresses the sensitivity of the very receptors that would normally tell you to stop earlier. The threshold for full gradually shifts upward. What follows the large meal is equally important. A sudden large carbohydrate load causes blood glucose to spike sharply. The pancreas releases a large pulse of insulin to bring it down. This overshoots in many people, causing a reactive dip in blood sugar, the energy crash that arrives 1 to 2 hours after a heavy meal, the tiredness, the brain fog, the craving for something sweet again. All of it is the biological aftermath of a blood sugar spike that came from eating past the point where your body actually needed more food. The clinical guidance from research into mindful eating consistently points to the same intervention, stopping at around 80% full, a concept that has been practiced in Okinawa, Japan, for generations under the term harahachibu. Populations that practice this consistently show lower rates of metabolic disease. This is not coincidence. The fourth health mistake is using fullness as the stopping signal when the signal arrives too late to be useful. Most people associate dehydration with thirst, with a dry mouth, with the feeling that you absolutely need water right now. But by the time thirst becomes obvious, your body is already operating in a mildly compromised state. The kidneys are already working harder than they should. Concentration and attention are already below baseline. The dehydration that causes cognitive impairment, elevated kidney stress, and skin changes does not announce itself with dramatic thirst. It settles in quietly when fluid intake is consistently below what the body needs. Your kidneys filter approximately 120 to 150 liters of blood every single day. That is roughly the volume of a standard bathtub, filtered and cleaned every 24 hours. The kidney's job is to extract waste, balance electrolytes, and regulate the body's acid-base chemistry. They do this by dissolving those waste products in water and excreting them as urine. When water intake is consistently low, a hormone called arginine vasopressin, released by the pituitary gland at the base of your brain, instructs the kidneys to reabsorb as much water as possible. Urine becomes concentrated. The dissolved minerals in that concentrated urine, calcium, oxalate, uric acid, reach levels at which they start to crystallize. These crystals grow into kidney stones, which are exactly as painful as anyone who has had one will confirm. Kidney stones are not rare. In the United States, the lifetime prevalence sits at roughly 9.25%. In the United Kingdom, closer to 14%. These numbers are rising, driven in part by widespread chronic underhydration, combined with the high sodium, high fructose diets that are now standard in most developed nations. Beyond kidney stones, mild chronic dehydration reduces blood volume slightly, which makes the heart work harder to maintain circulation. It reduces the efficiency of nutrient delivery to muscles and organs, and it produces the kind of brain fog that many people attribute to other causes: stress, poor sleep, or simply one of those days, when the actual cause is that they have had 2 cups of coffee and nothing else since waking up. The fifth health mistake is confusing the absence of obvious thirst with adequate hydration. Walk into any supermarket and count what is on the shelves. The items that come in a package have a long list of ingredients and would not exist in their current form without an industrial process. These are ultra-processed foods. They are not universally bad for you. But at the scale at which people in modern societies consume them, the epidemiological data is consistent and alarming. In the United Kingdom, ultra-processed foods account for approximately 57% of the calories that adults consume daily. In the United States, the figure is similar. This is not an occasional indulgence. It is the dominant source of nutrition for the majority of people in developed countries. A review published in the British Medical Journal linked higher consumption of ultra-processed foods to 32 adverse health outcomes. Research from the UK Biobank, one of the largest health studies ever conducted, following over 197,000 participants, found that every 10 percentage point increase in ultra-processed food consumption was associated with a 2% increase in overall cancer risk and a 6% increase in cancer-related mortality. A separate analysis found that a 10% increase in ultra-processed food consumption was linked to an 18% increase in obesity prevalence in men and a 17% increase in women. The mechanisms behind these associations are not mysterious. Ultra-processed foods are engineered to be rapidly absorbed, delivering large glucose loads quickly. They are typically low in fiber, which means they do not feed the beneficial bacteria in your colon. They often contain emulsifiers, chemical compounds that keep ingredients blended, which research suggests may disrupt the mucus layer that protects the gut lining. Their high sodium content strains the kidneys. Their refined carbohydrate content drives insulin spikes. The gut microbiome, the ecosystem of trillions of bacteria living in your colon, needs dietary fiber to survive. These bacteria ferment fiber into short-chain fatty acids, particularly a molecule called butyrate, which is the primary energy source for the cells lining your colon. Butyrate maintains the integrity of the gut lining, keeps tight junctions between cells properly closed, and dampens inflammatory signals throughout the body. When you consistently eat a diet low in fiber and high in ultra-processed food, you starve this ecosystem. The diversity of bacterial species drops. The gut lining becomes more permeable. Inflammatory signals increase. Better dietary alternatives do not require perfection. They require proportion. Minimally processed whole foods, vegetables, legumes, whole grains, fruits, nuts, are not expensive luxuries. They are the dietary context in which human biology evolved and for which it remains optimized. The sixth health mistake is allowing ultra-processed food to become the majority of what you eat, rather than the exception. There is a biological process happening in your gut right now. If you have not eaten in the past 2 hours, that most people have never heard of, despite the fact that it runs in a predictable cycle throughout your entire life. It is called the migrating motor complex. It is a wave of muscular contractions that sweeps through the stomach and small intestine in a repeating cycle roughly every 90 to 120 minutes during fasting. The third phase of this cycle generates high-amplitude contractions, strong enough to sweep undigested debris, dead cells, and bacteria from the small intestine down into the large intestine where they belong. This is your gut's housekeeping mechanism. It only works when you are not eating, the moment you consume even a small amount of calories. A handful of crackers, a protein bar, a flavored drink with sugar in it. The migrating motor complex stops. Your gut switches from housekeeping mode to digestion mode. If you eat again before the cycle completes, the housekeeping never finishes. For people who graze continuously throughout the day, this process is chronically interrupted. The uncleared material in the small intestine begins to accumulate. Bacteria that normally live in the large intestine migrate upward and colonize the small intestine, where they do not belong. This condition is called small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, or SIBO, and its symptoms, chronic bloating, gas, irregular bowel movements, pain after eating, are some of the most common digestive complaints in clinical practice. Grazing also prevents blood glucose from returning to its baseline between meals. The pancreas never gets a rest from releasing insulin. Over time, this continuous insulin demand is one of the metabolic drivers of insulin resistance. This is not an argument for extreme fasting. It is an argument for structured eating windows. Actual gaps between meals that allow your gut's maintenance systems to complete their work. The seventh health mistake is eating so frequently that your body never enters the maintenance state it was designed to depend on. The liver is a remarkably resilient organ. It can regenerate substantial portions of itself. It processes everything you eat and drink before it reaches the rest of your body. But one specific substance, liquid fructose, exerts a metabolic load on liver tissue that is genuinely unusual. When you drink a sweetened soda, an energy drink, or a sugary coffee, the fructose in it is absorbed rapidly from the gut and delivered direct to the liver through the portal vein in a concentrated surge. In this context, it behaves very differently from the fructose in whole fruit, which arrives slowly because the cellular fiber matrix of the fruit slows absorption. Fructose enters the liver and is processed by an enzyme called fructokinase. Unlike the enzymes that handle glucose, fructokinase has no feedback mechanism. It keeps processing fructose even when energy is already abundant. This processing consumes large amounts of the molecule that cells use for energy, called ATP. When ATP is depleted rapidly, the liver generates uric acid as a byproduct. Elevated uric acid contributes to gout, kidney stones, and cardiovascular disease. Simultaneously, the excess products of this fructose processing are converted into fat through a process called de novo lipogenesis. The liver literally manufacturing fat from sugar. This fat accumulates in liver cells. Combined with the inflammatory effects of the process, this is the mechanism that drives non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, now formally renamed metabolic dysfunction-associated steatotic liver disease, or MASLD. MASLD can progress from simple fat accumulation in the liver. It can advance to inflammatory damage of liver tissue, then to fibrosis, the scarring of liver tissue, then to cirrhosis, and in some cases to liver cancer. These are not rare outcomes. MASLD is currently the most common chronic liver disease in the world, affecting an estimated 25% of the global population. The sixth most consumed beverage in many developed countries is some form of sweetened soft drink. The problem is not the occasional glass. It is the daily habit. One can of soda at lunch, a sweetened energy drink in the afternoon, that delivers fructose to the liver in quantities and at a speed that evolution never designed it to handle. The eighth health mistake is drinking sugar daily and treating it as hydration. Cortisol is not a villain. In the correct context, a genuine emergency, a sudden physical threat, it is one of the most useful hormones in your body. It raises blood glucose for immediate energy. It sharpens focus. It suppresses non-essential functions to direct resources towards survival. The problem is that your stress response system cannot distinguish between a physical threat and a prolonged psychological one. A difficult work environment, financial pressure, relationship conflict, social anxiety, Any of these experienced continuously will keep cortisol elevated in ways that were never meant to be sustained. When cortisol levels remain chronically high, the fat storage priorities of your body shift. Visceral fat cells, the fat that accumulates deep in the abdomen, surrounding the liver, intestines, and other organs, have roughly 4 times the density of cortisol receptors compared to subcutaneous fat. This means they are exquisitely sensitive to cortisol's signal to store more fat. Research at Yale University confirmed that women with higher abdominal fat secreted more cortisol in response to the same stressors than women with lower abdominal fat, and also felt those stressors as more threatening. The visceral fat and the cortisol sensitivity were reinforcing each other. Visceral fat is not passive storage. It is an active endocrine organ. It secretes its own inflammatory chemicals, interleukin-6 and tumor necrosis factor alpha, directly into the portal circulation that feeds the liver. These inflammatory molecules circulate systemically, cross the blood-brain barrier, alter serotonin and dopamine pathways, and suppress immune function. Chronic high cortisol also disrupts sleep architecture, driving the person deeper into the cycle by making sleep less restorative. This is why researchers in the field of psychoneuroimmunology, a field studying the connection between psychological states and immune function, increasingly describe chronic stress not as a mental health issue with physical side effects, but as a systemic physiological condition that happens to originate in mental experience. Managing stress is not a lifestyle luxury. It is a direct intervention in cardiovascular disease risk, metabolic disease risk, immune function, and neurological health. The 9th health mistake is treating stress as a tolerable background condition rather than an active biological stressor that accumulates damage over time. Starting around the age of 50, skeletal muscle mass in the average adult declines at a rate of 1 to 2% per year. Muscle strength declines even faster, roughly 1.5% per year between 50 and 60, and 3% per year after 60. By the time most people reach 80, they have lost between 30 and 50% of the muscle mass they had at their peak. This process has a name, sarcopenia. And it is not purely cosmetic. Muscle is the largest metabolically active tissue in your body. It is where the majority of glucose uptake happens after a meal. As muscle mass decreases, insulin resistance increases. The metabolism slows. Fat accumulates in its place. Bone density also declines in parallel because the mechanical forces that muscle exerts on bone during movement are one of the primary signals that tell bone cells to remain active and dense. Lose the muscle and the bone weakens too. This combined state is called osteosarcopenia. The clinical consequences are serious. The Foundation for the National Institutes of Health Sarcopenia Project found that in adults aged 60 to 70, sarcopenia affects between 5 and 13% of people. By age 80 and over, that rises to between 11 and 50%. Osteosarcopenia increases the risk of skeletal fractures by 58%, substantially impairs mobility and independence, and is associated with a 41% increase in all-cause mortality compared to people who maintain muscle mass. The only reliable non-drug intervention for this is progressive resistance training, exercising with loads that challenge the muscles. Not light weights lifted for comfort, but weights that create mechanical demand sufficient to trigger muscle protein synthesis. Bodyweight exercises, resistance bands, and free weights all qualify. 2 to 3 sessions per week is the minimum dose supported by the evidence. The misconception that strength training is for young people, or for those who want to look a certain way, is one of the most consequential myths in mainstream health culture. For older adults in particular, it is arguably the single most important form of exercise they can do, more protective of their independence and longevity than any other single intervention. The 10th health mistake is neglecting resistance training entirely and losing muscle mass as if it were an inevitable consequence of aging rather than a reversible one. In 2024, the American Heart Association published a scientific statement on periodontal disease and atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease. Its conclusion, based on a review of decades of research, was that the link between gum disease and heart disease is not coincidental. It is mechanistic. Periodontitis, which is advanced gum disease, affects somewhere between 40 and 50% of adults globally. It is caused by a biofilm of bacteria living below the gum line, in the pockets between the teeth and the gum tissue. Among the primary pathogens is a bacterium called Porphyromonas gingivalis, a gram-negative anaerobe that is remarkably effective at evading immune detection and producing enzymes that destroy the surrounding tissue. When gum tissue is inflamed and diseased, the physical act of chewing, brushing, or even swallowing allows bacteria to enter the bloodstream. This is called transient bacteremia. Once in circulation, these bacterial cells and the fragments of their cell walls, called lipopolysaccharides, trigger a systemic immune response. The liver produces C-reactive protein. Interleukin-1 beta, interleukin-6, and tumor necrosis factor alpha rise in the blood. This systemic inflammatory load contributes to endothelial dysfunction, damage to the inner lining of blood vessels, and accelerates the formation of atherosclerotic plaques. Porphyromonas gingivalis DNA has been found in atherosclerotic plaques from cardiovascular patients. Live cultures of the bacterium have been recovered from atheromatous tissue removed during procedures. In animal models, colonizing animals with periodontal pathogens promotes atherosclerotic lesions. The biological pathway is real. Meta-analyses of the clinical data indicate that periodontitis increases the risk of coronary heart disease by between 1.14 and 2.2 times. Periodontal treatment. Deep cleaning of the gum pockets, followed by maintenance, has been shown to reduce circulating inflammatory markers and improve the function of blood vessel walls. Daily brushing twice, flossing once, and attending dental cleanings twice a year is not about cosmetics. It is about keeping bacteria out of your bloodstream. The 11th health mistake is treating oral health as separate from the rest of the body. When you hold your head in a neutral, upright position, the weight your cervical spine supports is approximately 10 to 12 pounds, roughly the weight of a standard bowling ball. Now tilt your head forward 15 degrees to glance at a phone. The effective load on your cervical spine rises to 27 pounds. At 30 degrees, 40 pounds. At 45 degrees, which is approximately the angle most people adopt while scrolling through a phone, the load reaches 49 pounds. At 60 degrees, it is 60 pounds. These calculations were produced by orthopedic surgeon Dr. Kenneth Hansraj through biomechanical modeling. They represent the forces your cervical spine absorbs during positions you likely hold for hours every day. The average adult in the United Kingdom spends just over 6 hours per day looking at a phone screen. In the United States, the figure is just over 7 hours. Across those hours, the cumulative compressive load on the cervical spine is substantial. Sustained heavy loading leads to muscular imbalances, accelerated degeneration of the cervical intervertebral discs, osteophyte formation, and the flattening of the cervical spine's natural curve, a condition associated with chronic pain, reduced range of motion, and in advanced cases, neurological symptoms radiating into the arms. But the musculoskeletal damage is only one part of the problem. The content on screens is engineered to produce a specific neurological effect, the intermittent reward cycle. Social media platforms in particular deliver unpredictable bursts of social validation, likes, comments, reactions, in a pattern that activates the same dopamine pathways as other forms of intermittent reinforcement. This drives compulsive checking behavior, shortens attention spans, and creates a state of chronic low-level alertness that is metabolically expensive and neurologically draining. Blue light emitted by screens at night suppresses melatonin secretion, which delays sleep onset and disrupts the circadian rhythm. The circadian rhythm is not just about when you feel tired. It coordinates insulin secretion, cortisol release, immune activity, and cellular repair processes across the entire body. Disrupting it chronically has consequences that extend well beyond feeling groggy in the morning. The 12th health mistake is an unmanaged relationship with screens, particularly in the hour before sleep and during meals. Systemic hypertension, chronically elevated blood pressure, affects nearly half of all adults in developed countries. Among those people, research suggests that up to 36% are entirely undiagnosed. They have high blood pressure, they do not know it, they feel fine. High blood pressure damages blood vessels gradually. It accelerates the formation of atherosclerotic plaques. It increases the risk of stroke and heart attack in proportion to how long it goes undetected and untreated. The reason so many people are undiagnosed is straightforward. There are no symptoms, not at moderate elevations, not until something structural fails. The same is true of dyslipidemia, elevated cholesterol or triglycerides in the blood. It is measurable only through a blood test. Its consequences, accelerated cardiovascular disease, develop over decades. The person whose LDL cholesterol has been elevated for 10 years feels no different from the person whose levels are optimal. Early-stage colorectal cancer is similarly silent. Adenomatous polyps, the precancerous growths that colonoscopy detects and removes, produce no symptoms. A colonoscopy performed during the screening window between ages 45 and 75, according to current United States Preventive Services Task Force guidelines, can both detect these growths and remove them during the same procedure. The cancer that might have developed in the following decade is prevented entirely. Preventive screening is not an overreach of medicine. It is the detection of biological processes that will not announce themselves until they have already done significant damage. The time between when a problem is detectable and when it becomes symptomatic is the window during which intervention is most effective and least costly, in every sense of the word. The 13th health mistake is waiting until symptoms appear to engage with the healthcare system. Every week, a new health intervention achieves viral status. A specific combination of ingredients that detoxifies the liver. A diet that strips inflammation from the body in 30 days. A supplement that replaces a category of food. The people promoting these interventions often have compelling physiques and compelling testimonials. Let us be precise about what the liver actually does, because it is genuinely impressive and requires no commercial assistance. The liver processes fat-soluble compounds, including medications, alcohol, environmental toxins, and normal metabolic byproducts, through a two-phase system. In the first phase, enzymes from a family called cytochrome P450 chemically modify these compounds, introducing reactive groups that make them accessible for the second phase. In the second phase, the liver attaches molecules like glutathione, sulfate, glycine, or glucuronic acid to the reactive intermediates, converting them into water-soluble compounds that the kidneys can filter and excrete in urine. This process runs continuously. It does not need help from a 3-day juice cleanse. What it does need is consistent hydration, adequate dietary protein, which provides the amino acids used in phase 2, and a diet with sufficient fiber and sulfur-containing compounds found in foods like cruciferous vegetables, garlic, and onions. Extreme juice cleanses by eliminating protein and often reducing fiber can actually impair phase 2 detoxification by depriving the liver of the amino acids it requires for the conjugation reactions. Similarly, the framing of social comparison in fitness culture causes measurable harm. Research using predictive models found that the 3 strongest predictors of a condition called muscle dysmorphia, a psychological disorder characterized by a pathological obsession with body composition that mirrors eating disorder patterns but focuses on muscularity, were daily social media screen time, frequency of comparison with fitness influencers, and behavior oriented around seeking social validation for appearance. The algorithm does not deliver you an accurate picture of human biology. It delivers you outliers, optimized for engagement, photographed under ideal conditions, often chemically assisted in ways that are not disclosed. Consistency with realistic behaviors, adequate sleep, regular movement, whole food, stress management produces better health outcomes than any trend-driven intervention applied briefly and abandoned. The 14th health mistake is outsourcing health decisions to viral content and unregulated commercial products. The separation between mental health and physical health in how most people think about their bodies is not supported by biology. They are the same system viewed from different angles. When someone experiences chronic anxiety, prolonged depression, or occupational burnout, the sustained activation of the stress response elevates cortisol. Over time, chronic cortisol elevation causes glucocorticoid resistance in immune cells, meaning those cells stop responding normally to cortisol signal to stand down. In the absence of that regulatory signal, immune cells produce excessive amounts of inflammatory cytokines. These cytokines, the same interleukin-6 and tumor necrosis factor alpha that appear throughout this script in multiple contexts, travel in the bloodstream, cross the blood-brain barrier, and directly alter brain chemistry. They activate the brain's resident immune cells called microglia. They accelerate the breakdown of the amino acid tryptophan along a pathway that reduces serotonin synthesis. They impair the dopamine reward pathways in the brain's motivational circuitry. The result is a bidirectional feedback loop. Mental distress produces systemic inflammation, and systemic inflammation produces and worsens mental distress. This is not a theory. It is a well-characterized mechanism described in the peer-reviewed literature of psychoneuroimmunology, a field that has been building its evidence base for over 3 decades. This mechanism explains why people with major depression have elevated inflammatory markers in their blood. It explains why anti-inflammatory treatments show some efficacy in treatment-resistant depression. It explains why chronic physical illness so frequently produces depression as a secondary condition. Seeking professional support for anxiety, depression, or burnout is not a sign of weakness or a separate category of health decision. It is an intervention that operates through the same biological pathways as medication, exercise, and nutrition, and that has measurable downstream effects on cardiovascular health, immune function, and metabolic disease risk. The 15th health mistake is treating mental health as something to manage privately and indefinitely, rather than seeking support that interrupts the physical cascade before it compounds further. In 2024, a behavioral scientist at Stanford named B.J. Fogg published a model for how human behavior actually changes, as opposed to how people believe it changes. The common assumption is that motivation drives behavior. If you want something badly enough, you will do it. This assumption produces a specific failure mode. You set a large, ambitious goal when motivation is high, attempt it for a few days, motivation declines, the behavior fails, and you conclude that you lack discipline. Fogg's research found something different. Motivation fluctuates. It is not reliable. The behaviors that persist are the ones designed to require minimal motivation, because they are so small and so well anchored to existing routines that the question of motivation never really arises. The practical implication is counterintuitive. The most effective health change you can make is not the biggest one you can sustain at peak motivation. It is the smallest one you can sustain at minimum motivation. Not 30 minutes of exercise, but 2 minutes. Not a complete dietary overhaul, but 1 additional serving of vegetables per day. Not eliminating screens after 8 p.m., but placing your phone in another room before getting into bed. Mathematically, a 1% daily improvement in any domain compounds to a 37-fold improvement over a year. The compounding is the point. The tiny change executed consistently for long enough builds the infrastructure, the neural pathways, the habits, the environmental arrangements. For larger changes that become genuinely easy rather than performatively heroic, the choice then is not between doing everything at once and doing nothing. It is between beginning something small today and waiting for a day, a Monday, a new month, when motivation will supposedly be higher. That day tends not to arrive on schedule. The small action, started now, tends to persist. There is a useful historical parallel for what this video is about. In the 1950s, heart disease rates in developed countries were rising sharply. Researchers had identified some suspected contributors: smoking, dietary fat, physical inactivity, but the connections were not yet fully established in the public mind. Most people who were developing heart disease felt fine until they didn't. The disease was silent, cumulative, and almost entirely preventable. Over the following decades, through epidemiological research, public health campaigns, changes in medical practice, and shifts in cultural norms, particularly around smoking, mortality from cardiovascular disease in the United States fell by more than 70%. Not because a cure was found, because the underlying behaviors that drove it were understood and changed at scale. The habits described in this video represent a similar opportunity. The mechanisms are understood, the research is published and replicated. The interventions, most of them, cost nothing and require no prescription. What they require is the replacement of one set of normalized behaviors with another. No single change fixes everything. Sleep alone does not compensate for a diet of ultra-processed food. Exercise alone does not compensate for unmanaged chronic stress. Dental hygiene alone does not compensate for never having a blood pressure reading. These systems interact, but they also reinforce each other in the positive direction. Better sleep reduces cortisol, which reduces visceral fat accumulation, which reduces systemic inflammation, which improves sleep. Every entry point into that cycle is a valid one. The question is not which habit is most important. The question is which one you are going to stop doing first. Start there. Start small. Start today.